Veterans OneStop at Waco, Texas, with a group of veterans, and we're continuing our study in the book of Acts. And so if you're joining us online or if you're watching this later as a video, we thank you for taking the time to be with us today. So if you want to join us, we're going to be opening our Bibles to the book of Acts, and I'll start with a short review back in about chapter 22 or so, but we're going to be moving into chapters 24, 25, and even maybe, if I get the chance, into 26. I don't know if we'll get that far or not. We'll see. If you take a look back at Acts chapter 22, this is where Paul has completed his missionary journeys, and he is, there it is. I can get my notes straight here. He's completed his missionary journeys, and he's traveled to Jerusalem. Let's see here. Yes, absolutely. He's traveled to Jerusalem, and while he was in Jerusalem delivering gifts to the church and other things, he was arrested. And the Jews had raised quite a ruckus, and so they were about to tear him apart, and he was rescued by the Roman soldiers. And then he asked the Romans to allow him to give a defense of himself to the Jews there at the temple. And so he gives this defense, and they actually listen attentively until he says, "God has sent me to who?" Do you remember? God has sent me to take the gospel to who? The Gentiles. And at the name or the mention of the Gentiles, the Jews are not so happy. And so they just about rip him apart again, and the soldiers have to take him inside. The soldiers then are going to torture him to find out what's going on until he raises the situation. Says, "Hey, wait a minute, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't do that to me." And so wanting to find out what the situation is, the Roman commander says, "Okay, I can't torture you. I understand that, but obviously something's wrong." And so he brings Paul before the Sanhedrin in chapter 23, trying to get a sense of what's happening here, what's going on. And so Paul then is now in front of the Sanhedrin. So first he makes his defense before the crowd. Now he makes his defense before the Sanhedrin. And as he gets to the Sanhedrin, he recognizes that this ruling group is made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. And of course, these two parties in Judaism don't get along. And so he calls out in the crowd, he says, "What I'm really on trial for is the hope of the resurrection." Now, how would that divide the Sanhedrin? Anybody remember?
The Sadducees believe in the resurrection.
Okay, it's the Pharisees. The Pharisees believe in the resurrection, right? But the Sadducees did not. And so when he said that I'm on trial for my hope in the resurrection, all of a sudden the Sanhedrin goes, "Oh, wait a minute." If they were a Pharisee, they say, "Well, this guy might have something here." And if they were a Sadducee, they said, "No, we're going to continue pressing these charges because there is no resurrection." And go ahead. So
no angels or spirits.
Yeah, and no spirit, kind of no spiritual world almost, right? There's none of that exists in their world, in their understanding. And so he divides the assembly, and once again, the assembly becomes so much out of control that the Romans have to rescue him. And so that's kind of almost where we left off. We left off. Well, the next thing they do is the Jews decide that they're going to plot to kill Paul. And this is what we discussed at length last week. They conspired with the elders and the chief priests and all. Let's ask them to ask Paul back out to see us again, and we'll kill him before he can even get here while he's en route. And so when the Romans heard about this, they gathered up the troops, right? And they sent Paul off to Caesarea, to the Roman capital of the region. And so you may remember, this is no little party. There was 200 infantry soldiers, 70 cavalry soldiers, and a contingent of 200 The NIV says spearmen, but we don't really know exactly what that term means. It's a very unique term, but there's a bunch. That's the point, is there's a whole bunch of folks going to protect Paul. And this is no easy journey. It's 70, 75 miles. And so they go 30 miles that night immediately. And then the infantry turns around and heads back, the 200 soldiers. And the cavalry continues with Paul from that halfway point all the way into Caesarea and arrives the next day. And so after this trip, when they arrive in Caesarea, the commander had written a letter to the governor. And this is kind of where we left off last week. The commander writes this letter and saying that I don't know what to do because the Jews were trying to kill this guy and he's a Roman citizen. And I don't really know because the trouble that seems to be some kind of religious trouble. And so I'm presenting him to you to decide what to do. And so that's where we left off. And the trial is now going to continue before the governor, whose name is Felix. Now, I don't know if I said anything about Felix last week, but Felix was not known as a friend of the Jews. He was known as a person who was very cruel in the way that he put down Jewish uprisings. And so this is kind of a chancy thing to stand before Felix and know that he's not very much of a softy. He was going to take a hard stance against any Jew that was raising trouble. If a Jew was raising trouble, well then squish him, right? I mean, he was not going to have trouble while he was governor. He was just going to quell any uprising. And so this is the person that Paul had been summoned to make his defense before. So that's where we're at when we left off last week. And so if you actually have your notes from last week, on the back page of those notes, we move into chapter 24 of the book of Acts. So let's begin I'm going to begin reading the text in Acts chapter 24, verse 1. This is Paul's trial before Felix. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea, and we've said this before. Why does it say he goes down to Caesarea?
It ain't up, that's for sure.
That's right, because it ain't up. Jerusalem was elevation-wise higher. Caesarea was on the coast, and Jerusalem's in the mountains. And so they went down physically to Caesarea. And so he went down to Caesarea, this is the high priest, with the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus. Now, here lawyers always get the bad rap, the bad name, right? And in this case, Tertullus is going to try to present the case of the Jews against Paul. And he's going to be presenting his case before the governor, right? And so they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. Verse 2. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. Now listen to how Tertullus starts out. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. What's he doing?
Kissing up.
Now, nobody's ever done that to your commanding officer, have you? Or your sergeant? Or you ever remember times in the military where you would have been maybe under a little duress, and so Matt, you're laughing. It's pretty common to kind of try to make things butter up somebody a little bit.
Is that called brown?
Yeah, brown nosing, just kind of, yeah. Yeah, exactly. So this is actually a very common way to begin a trial. Appeal to the judge, try to win over his favor, right? Say something that would win him over to your side right up front. Well, Tertullus actually goes a little overboard here. He's gone beyond just trying to win favor, and he's kind of really buttering up this guy, the the governor, trying to make it look, like we really appreciate you. The fact is, the Jews didn't appreciate him. The Jews hated him. They did not like Felix at all. And so, because again, Felix was known as an oppressor. Yeah, he brought peace, but the way he brought peace was, oh, you caused trouble?
Yeah.
I'll put a stop to that, right? So he was not their friend. So Tertullus goes on to say, we have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. And that's verse 5. He is a ringleader. Now, so that's charge number 1. He's a troublemaker. Charge number 2, he is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect. And we'll come back to that word in just a minute. And even tried, charge number 3, to desecrate the temple. So we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about these charges that we're bringing against him. And then the Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true, all the other elders and Jews that had come down from Jerusalem. So, what do you think about these charges? What kind of charges are they?
I think they're
Trumped
pretty
up.
serious.
Okay, they're trumped up, number 1.
I think they're serious charges.
Okay, yeah, number 2, they're serious charges. Any charge that had any kind of political overtones, saying that these guys is a troublemaker, he's causing riots, that's not going to be tolerated by the Romans. So these are serious charges, political charges, the first one. The second one, that he's a ringleader of the Nazarene sect, that's not as serious, because that was just a religious question. That was, let the Jews, kind of work that out amongst themselves. But the third charge, that he'd caused trouble at the temple, was also a serious, almost political kind of question, because the Romans had given the Jews significant power in the temple area to manage the temple. And if this guy is disturbing the temple, then he's disturbing Roman law as well as Jewish law. And so these were serious charges, but they were also trumped up charges.
But I mean, they had all these charges against them. Where did they come up with these?
Okay, this is exactly how Paul is going to respond. The time out. You're accusing me of these things, but that's not true. He's going to take each charge one at a time and show how each charge doesn't stand the test, right? He's not going to be accused of these things. And this word sect, it's kind of like being accused of being a heretic. In fact, that's the word that we get our word heresy or heretic from. That's the Greek word for that. It is he's being charged with being a heretic. Now, the Romans were pretty broad in allowing people to worship the various gods and that sort of thing. But there were some groups that, if it was a heretical sect that was causing trouble, they would not tolerate that. Right. So this also is a charge that, even though it was a religious charge, it could implicate Paul in some serious misdoing. So these are all serious charges, but they're not supportable. Even though they're all saying, oh yeah, these things are true. Then the governor, in verse 10, motioned for Paul to speak. And so Paul replied, I know that for a number of years you have been judge over this nation. So I gladly make my defense. What has Paul done? He has just recognized the leadership or the appropriateness of his case being brought before Felix. And so he too tries to win the favor of Felix, but in a much more subdued manner. He's not flattering, right? He's not going overboard like Tertullus did. He just is recognizing the situation. I know that you've been a judge, and so I, over this nation, and so I gladly make my defense. And then he says, you can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago, I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple or stirring up a crowd, excuse me, in a synagogue or anywhere else in the city. He says, no, wait a minute, time out. They're accusing me of instigating a riot. That's just not true. I didn't do it. I was just there to worship. Who instigated the riots? Do you remember? The Jews, yeah. Do you remember which Jews instigated the riots in the temple when they saw Paul? Back in chapter 22. It was Jews from Asia who had come to Jerusalem to worship. These were Jews that had stood against Paul when Paul was on his missionary trips. And they're the ones that had stirred up the crowd. And this guy's a heretic. This guy's, desecrating the temple. This guy is causing trouble all over the world. And now he's come here. Those kind of charges. But they weren't there before Felix. Now, this is a serious situation. Sometimes we overlook today. We don't know about. If someone made a charge that brought about the arrest of another individual, and then that person who made the charge did not come before the authorities to state their charge before the authorities, but it simply stirred up a crowd, their refusal to come before the authorities and make that charge was in and of itself a crime. Under Roman law, they had to stand before the authorities to make that charge in order that they themselves could not be charged with rioting. Does that make sense? But they were not there. So these Jews that weren't there were violating Roman law. All right. So Paul is saying, look, I wasn't doing what Tertullus is accusing me of. And you can verify this. You can go back and ask all kinds of people, witnesses. I wasn't stirring up the crowds. That's false. So he says, you cannot prove the charges they cannot prove the charges that they're now making against me. And then he addresses the second situation. Oh,
I forgot to turn it
oh,
off.
that's all right. Oh, there you go. Thank you. So he says, the second charge, however, I admit that I worship the God of our fathers as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. Now, he's going to make his defense basically saying, I'm not a heretic. I admit I follow the way, but that is not a heresy. What he's going to say is there is continuity between the Jewish law and prophets and what I'm proclaiming today as Jesus being the Messiah and me being a follower of Jesus. This stands in continuity with what the Jews have always claimed. It's not a break. It's not heresy. It is what we expected. The Messiah has come. Okay, so this is what he says. I believe everything that agrees with the law and is written in the prophets. I have the same hope in the same God as these men, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. And so I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. In other words, I'm not a heretic. I stand in line with all Jews. And I believe in the same God. I have the same hope. I have the same concern for my conscience. So all these things. So Paul has made his defense first that he's not been a troublemaker, and second, he's not a heretic. Now he's going to address the third charge, that he stirred up trouble and that he violated the temple. He said, after an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. In other words, I came there to Jerusalem and to the temple to worship. And I did so in good faith, following the law. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. Or these who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin, unless it was this one thing that I shouted as I stood in their presence. It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am in trial before you today. So, what do you think of Paul's defense?
I would think it would be strong.
Okay, it was a strong defense. Yeah, it was a solid defense. He's not afraid. And this is amazing because this man, Felix, could just say, take him away, be done with him. Just with a snap of his fingers,
Yeah.
and he'd be gone.
Even with Paul knowing that how Felix feels about the Jews, he doesn't deny the fact that he's a Jew and he worships their God and everything,
Yes, exactly.
It can't be much more straightforward.
He doesn't back down. He is strong in his faith, and he is willing to stand up even if it means his death. And that's very well could have been his death, standing before this judge.
But you've got this judge, who we read a couple of paragraphs later, has a Jewish wife.
Yes.
Felix has a Jewish wife. So he has heard about the way.
Yes.
He has heard the gospel, so to speak. And
he's heard about what's going on in.
He may be a little on the fence here.
Yes. And so, in fact, the very next verse says, then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way. And that's probably because of his Jewish wife, right? Felix, because who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. And this is what he says: when Lysias, the commander, comes, then I will decide your case. So he kind of puts it off, right? He is not going to upset the Jews because he doesn't want to riot, but he's also not willing to convict Paul because he knows about all that's going on, and so he makes this excuse to put off the case. I'm going to wait till the commander gets here, basically. And so he orders the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. So where was he being held? Do you remember we covered this a couple of weeks ago? He was being held in Caesarea, but at what location in Caesarea? You're right, in Herod's temple. Not temple, in palace.
Palace.
In Herod's palace.
I was
Right.
trying to think of the name.
Yeah.
Palace, but I couldn't remember whose it was.
Yeah, Herod the Great had built this palace.
Yeah.
Right. So Herod the Great was the king who was alive when Jesus was born. He was the one who killed all the babies, right? And who had tried to kill the baby Jesus. His son is the one who beheaded John the Baptist. His grandson is the one who slew the apostle James with a sword. So this is not a family that's especially kind.
In good standing.
Yeah. So, but and this is going to carry on because in a couple chapters here, King Agrippa II is going to be the great grandson of Herod the Great. So this is the lineup that he keeps going, right?
Well, and this was in the early days of the way.
Yeah, of the Christian movement,
They
right?
didn't have an interest in squashing it. They didn't have the threat.
At this point, they did not. Now, in a few years, Nero was going to start persecution of Christians in Rome and other places. But at this point, at least, the Jews were persecuting the Christians, but it had not yet. The Romans had not taken an active interest in seeing to the persecution. This would happen fairly soon, but not yet. So Felix, acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. Said, when Lysias gets here, then I'll decide. And he ordered Paul to be kept under guard in Herod's palace, which would have been not. He was not like under chains and in a dungeon. He was in fairly comfortable circumstances for a person who's being kept as a prisoner. And then several days later, it says Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewess, and he sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. Talk about boldness. Paul is going to present the gospel of Jesus to this governor who has the authority to have him put to death at a snap of a finger.
But the fact that he was a Roman citizen
Yes.
allowed him a clear route
Yes.
to be able to defend himself in this manner.
Yeah, exactly. His Roman citizenship really was the protecting factor in all of this. So when he sent for Paul, he listened to him as he spoke about faith, as Paul discoursed on righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. What happened? What does the text say? What does your scriptures read?
Felix became frightened.
Yeah, Felix became frightened. The NIV says he was afraid. How does the King James read?
Which one is it?
It would be verse 20, 24, 25. Yeah.
25?
Yeah.
It says, but then I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death.
Oh, okay, that's a little bit after. So right before that, as Paul discoursed on righteousness, self-control, and judgment, Felix was.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's 24. Then.
Okay.
Well, that's when that was with the king.
Okay, we're in chapter 24.
Oh, I was 25.
Yeah, there you go. That's because that wasn't reading right. Yeah. So
okay, so 25.
20 chapter 24, verse 25.
Okay. Now that he has reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid.
Okay.
And answered.
All right.
Go away for now. When I have convenient time, I will call for you.
All right. So what does Felix do?
Backs down.
Backs down. Yeah. He's probably there's a possibility that he's on the fence. But if he converted, what would that mean? How would that impact him?
He'd lose all his authority.
He would be. He would.
No.
Who knows? He might lose all authority. He might lose everything in terms of human power. This was a costly decision that Paul was calling on him to make. A transformation of his entire life. And he wasn't willing to make that. He wasn't willing to give that up for the sake of the gospel. And so he said, when I could find it convenient, I'll send for you. And so he did. He continued to send for Paul, and he would hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. But because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. So Felix was actually recalled to Rome. The emperor was not happy with how he was handling things, and so he was recalled. He survived the recall. He wasn't put to death, but that was only because his brother, who was basically a friend of the emperor, spoke up for him. But he lost his job, essentially. And Festus then steps in. And this is the end of chapter 24. So now we can get to today's notes. How's that?
Well, this is all the prelude, right?
Well, catching up. This is what I had prepared notes for all the way through chapter 24 for last time, and we just didn't get quite to that point. So Paul makes his defense. Felix hears the gospel, is not ready to make that commitment. Eventually, he gets recalled, and this lasts for 2 years. So Paul is in limbo for 2 years. How do you like to wait? Billy?
Especially wait in prison.
Yeah, he's under guard.
Yeah.
So he has some freedom, but he is under guard. He can't go, just have freedom. Yeah, he's kind of like on parole in a sense. He is
House arrest.
He's like
under house arrest.
House arrest.
Yeah, under house arrest, basically. So he can't travel, can't do things, but people can come to him.
Really?
And so he has friends come to him, and people take care of him and give him the things that he needs to do things. So he can be active in ministry in many ways, but he's still under house arrest. So he's waiting to hear what's going to happen to me. So uh, now Festus arrives. Festus, we don't know much about. He seems to be of better character um, than Felix. Felix was demanding this bribe. He was wanting money to let Paul go, and Paul didn't do that. So he just kept him over, and he also wanted to do a favor to the Jews, so he left them instead of releasing them. This is another Roman law that they were not to exceed 2 years of house arrest. And here it was at the 2-year mark, and instead of letting him go, he just turned the case over to his successor, which should not have been done.
Well, and then again, it reset the clock.
Yeah, it kind of resets things, and Festus is going to have to start all over again with trying him. And so now Festus like I said, it seems to be a fairly a better character. And so when he arrives in the province, the first thing he does is he goes from Caesarea, his capital city, where he's going to rule from. He goes up to Jerusalem because he knows Jerusalem is where he needs to do a lot of his dealings with the Jewish leaders. So he goes to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and Jewish leaders appeared before him, and they present the charges against Paul, and they urgently request Festus as a favor to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem. Why? Because they wanted a fair trial.
Kill him before he got there.
Yeah, because they're still convinced that they had the opportunity to kill him if he's traveling, and so yeah, that's right. They're going to prepare an ambush to kill him along the way, and so Festus says, "Nope, Paul's being held at Caesarea, so I'm going back there. So if you want to charge him, let your leaders come with me and press charges, right? So I'm not doing this. I'm not taking him back to you. You come to me. I'm the one that's I'm the leader here, right? You're not in charge. I am. And so if you have some charges against him. If he's done something wrong, then you come and press those charges in my court." And so, after spending 8 or 10 days with them in Jerusalem, he went back down to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Caesarea. And the next day that he arrived in Caesarea, the next day he convened the court, and he ordered that Paul be brought before him. And when Paul appeared, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. And so once again, we're back to the same old situation. They're falsely accusing him of all kinds of things. And then now in this chapter, Luke does not tell us what those serious charges are. He just says they bring serious charges. So we don't know what they are. But Paul makes his defense. In his defense, he opens by saying, "I've done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews, against the temple, or against Caesar." So from Paul's defense, you can kind of surmise what he is being charged with, right? He is being charged with having gone against the law of the Jews, having desecrated the temple, and having some political charges of having violated the laws of Rome. And so this is where what he's defending against. And then Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges?" And Paul answered, "I'm now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I've not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I don't refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, No one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. So this is the way in which the Roman citizen could overcome false charges. He could make an appeal to the emperor. And so Festus, after having conferred with his council, declares, "You've appealed to Caesar? Okay, to Caesar you'll go." And this is where we find that Festus is, he is following the law. He's doing what's required of him as the new governor. And so when Paul appeals, he says, "Okay, you want that? I'll give it to you. You can," in fact, to oppose his appeal to Caesar would put him in trouble with Caesar.
Yeah.
Right. So he's not going to do that. He's going to say, "You want to go to Caesar? You're going." A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrive in Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. So King Agrippa is the overall ruler of this region. Festus is a governor of a specific area. The King Agrippa is the ruler of multiple regions in what we think of as Palestine today, this area. And so his headquarters was actually, he didn't have one set city that was his ruling city. He kind of moved around because he was over several areas, but most of the time he was to be found up in Caesarea Philippi, which is way up to the north. And so he travels down. That would have been quite a trip, another 70 plus mile trip for him to make out of the mountains of Caesarea Philippi, coming down to the coast of Caesarea Maritima. And so he makes this trip down because he wants to greet the new governor. And since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. And he said, "Hey, I got this case here, guy. I got this case, King Agrippa. Felix left him, left this situation in my court. He was probably not very happy that Felix did that." Right. So he discussed Paul's case with the king. "There is a man whom Felix left as a prisoner, and when I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. But I told them that that's not the Roman way. That's not the Roman custom to just hand over a man before he's had faced his accusers and had an opportunity to defend himself against their charges. And so when they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in." Now, this is interesting. When the accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. So what did Festus expect?
The original.
The original part that he had was crime.
Oh, okay. The original crimes, specifically crimes that would have been Roman crimes, right? This guy's a troublemaker. He's riotous. He's causing problems. Maybe he murdered some people in an insurrection, those kind of issues. But that's not, in verse 19, it says, "Instead, the Jews had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive." That's an interesting way to put it, isn't it? So I was at a loss, Festus said, how to investigate such matters. So I asked if he'd be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, "I want to hear about this. I want to hear this guy myself." Right? And he replied, "Tomorrow you will hear him." And so Paul is going to now appear before Agrippa. And that's all the time I have for today. So did that go by? It goes by quick for me. What a story.
The conflict between Roman rule and the Pharisaical rule.
Yeah.
That was really a balancing act because they wanted to maintain peace.
Yeah, it was a balancing act, and both Rome and Jerusalem were centers of power. Jerusalem's power lay in tradition and religion, Rome's power lay in the military and in organization. They were, they were the organizers and the governors of this area, political. But it's very interesting that now he's going to make one more defense before King Agrippa, the great grandson of Herod the Great. And so that's going to be the rest of chapter 25 and 20 and the beginning of 26 here when we go into all of this before Paul sails for Rome. We're actually very close to the end of the book of Acts, because after we finish these trials, he's going to sail off to Rome, and then once he's in Rome, we're going to find some adventures that he goes through, and then Paul continues to preach and teach even while he's under guard in Rome, and that's kind of going to be where the book of Acts ends. And so be thinking about where you want to go from here with regard to our textual studies. We have maybe just a couple weeks left in the text of the book of Acts. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see all of you again very soon. May God bless you as you go from here today.